Can everyone see that? All right, I'll start with the slide presentation. Good. All right. Okay, so well, thanks for, I just want to thank everyone, Mark and Luke, for organizing this and giving us an opportunity to also give these talks. I'm going to discuss today a increasingly common and surprisingly diverse designed or engineered ecosystem in the southeastern US. And I'm very interested in hearing about what the prevalence of this type of ecosystem and its characteristics in other parts of the world. It's stormwater ponds. First, I'm going to introduce you to what the heck these things are, in case you're not familiar with them. Of course, we know that urban landscapes have a lot of impervious surfaces, causing storm events. Well, storm events when water runs off instead of percolating into the ground, into the soils, it runs off impervious surfaces into our natural water bodies, bringing along with it issues such as soil erosion, flooding, and also washing off pollutants from those urban landscapes, such as a major one in the southeastern US are nitrogen and phosphorus, things that can affect the aquatic natural ecosystems. So these stormwater ponds are designed to capture for two functions, for flood control and to capture the pollutants that run off of urban landscapes. And generally, there's two types. There's temporary retention ponds. And what they do is water runs off of an urban landscape, it fills this basin and it's retained permanently and it slowly percolates down through the ground. And it's assumed that the pollution kind of stays up at the soil level and doesn't get down into the drinking water, okay, or into the aquifers. And then there's a permanent detention pond, which retains water, has water all the time in it. And what this does is water runs off the urban landscape, it goes in there, and we assume that pollution settles out and or is consumed or dealt with through biological processes. So, and then both of them were designed with overflow structures. In case the stormwater event is too large and this can't handle the volume of water, the water then is diverted out into an adjacent water body. Again, the primary function is flood control. Okay, so my lab, my postdoc, James Sinclair, mapped the stormwater ponds in Florida just to get an idea of how many there are. And that's what we see in blue here. And the research I'm going to present to you has been conducted in Gainesville, Florida, where the University of Florida is. Gray areas on this map are urbanizing areas. Green areas are natural or semi-natural areas. And we found over 76,000 stormwater ponds in Florida. And at large spatial scales, you see these patterns of connectivity. This is I-95 corridor. It's a major highway that goes up and down the east coast of the United States. You can see almost a network of connectivity between Orlando and Tampa, two major cities. So there's a lot of them. And what this figure here shows is area, how much space they're taking up. And they're actually taking up as much space in urban landscapes as other urban land covers, more than industrial, and approaching the same amount as recreational and even open lands. So there's a lot of them, and they're taking up a lot of space, and they seem to form these networks along among cities. So I started thinking about that, and I thought, okay, we have this ecosystem that's designed to capture nutrients, so it's nutrient rich. It's also highly dynamic with hydrology, so experiences frequent disturbance because of flooding and drying events. And it's also abundant and it's connected. So it's a potential dispersal network. So I wanted to know, this seems like a recipe for plant invasions in my mind. So I wanted to really look at that. And there's also differences in how these things are managed. And they're managed by a lot of different people or entities. So in some instances, they're built and they're left alone, and plants are freely there to establish. And, you know, we look at them, and you could probably take some people out here and they might think this is a natural wetland, but they wouldn't know any better. Then there's some that are maintained at a medium level, really for functionality. They'll mow around the edges to gain access to them. They'll pull out some of the plant material to ensure that the overflow structures don't clog up, but that's really the extent. But in Florida, we also have some that are maintained really highly, and people build homes around them, and they're sold as an amenity to the community, and they manicure them, and they want them to be mowed, and sometimes there's ornamental plantings. And so there's this gradient of management that can also affect what's establishing there. So we surveyed 30 stormwater ponds, 15 dry, the retention ponds, and 15 of the permanent ponds, shown in blue and green. And we looked at how many species were in these 30 ponds, and this shows the occurrence, how many species or how many ponds each of these species occurred in these invasive plants. And we found 28 different invasive plants in 30 ponds. So we found a high diversity of plant invaders in these habitats. And 71% of them, not surprisingly, in urban landscapes were introduced for ornamental purposes. But what else was very interesting was there were some common ones, 2 of them, but for the most part, all these plants occurred in low frequency of ponds. So there's a high species turnover for these invasive plants, which creates management concerns, right? So now you're not just managing 3 main invaders, you're actually, how you got to figure out now how to manage 28 different invaders. And again, it's only 30 ponds in a sample. Okay. So we said, all right, there's a lot of diversity, there's a lot of species turnover. What are the traits of these plants? So we did a trait analysis on these 28 species, and we found a lot of commonalities among the species regarding traits. This is, notice the scale starts at 0.7 for the proportion of species that have a particular trait. And unlike a large amount of urban plant invaders or ruderal species, they were tolerant of acidic soils. They were also perennial, all of them, and all of them were, of course, tolerant of disturbance. 95% of them reproduced asexually, but a large portion of them also had sexual reproduction. They had multiple modes of dispersal, animal and water. And considering the environment they were in, they had the trait of drought tolerance and flood tolerance. Again, these systems can be flooded or they can go dry for long periods in Florida where we have dry periods. So that's some of the traits we were finding out. So large commonality among the species in these traits. And if we wanted to understand how management affected the stormwater ponds as well. So we sampled invasive species richness and cover, both in the outer portions of the ponds and the inner portions of the ponds separately. And that's what this figure shows, outer and inner for richness. We saw a similar trend for cover, so I'm just showing you richness. And these are for the dry ponds, the ones that fill up and then percolate through the ground. And these are the wet ponds that have the permanent water bodies. Generally, some quick patterns that we saw were the dry ponds tended to have more invasion in them. And that makes sense because if you're invading a wet pond, it's the center part of it, you have to be an aquatic plant, right? You have the particular traits. Okay, the outer portions of the ponds tended to be more heavily invaded than the inner portions of the ponds. Again, you're talking about an aquatic plant or a plant that can deal with like being flooded or dry. So the banks probably are more of a terrestrial organisms or plants. And then finally, management intensity. These low management ponds had more invasion than the high management ponds, which makes sense. You're going in there, removing all the plant material. So we could manage it by just mowing frequently around these ponds. But, I argue that you're also limiting the utility of these ponds for native species then. Okay, now we found commonality among species, but we also found that management drove the traits of the types of species that established in these stormwater ponds. Generally, in the low managed ponds, we found woody, slow growing, heavier seeds. These are the traits here: drought tolerance and differences of chromosomes. But we saw these species that were allowed to establish, like indicative of systems with less disturbance. And then traits for the highly managed ponds were herbaceous, monocots, fast growing. They were asexual, bird dispersed, light seeds. You can read the rest of them, but they were more indicative of systems experiencing greater levels of disturbance, more early successional species. So we did see a variation in management affecting the types of invaders that establish in these ponds. So in summary, what we're finding is a lot of invasive plant species in just 30 stormwater ponds. We're finding high species turnover, high trait similarity, but we're also seeing how we manage these ponds. The vegetation in these ponds are affecting the amount of invasion and also the types of invaders that occur in them. So future work, we see them as habitat, but are they invasion vectors? I want to know to the degree to which these ponds affect movement of invasive plants and other species for that matter. They seem to be forming networks in urban areas. And I think we can get at that through some computational individual-based experiments. And I also look at these through the lens of conservation. Here's an example of a stormwater pond built on the University of Florida's campus that mimics a natural wetland and has a walking trail, so it serves as an amenity for the community to connect to nature. And there is a lot of diversity in these stormwater ponds that I didn't get to really talk about. They're utilized a lot by wildlife, and in some instances, they have higher macroinvertebrate diversity in the natural ponds. So that's where I see future work going with these common designed ecosystems. And with that, any questions? So I just wanted to introduce everyone to this ecosystem, just kind of get you to think about it when you look at it in the landscape. And I'm interested in hearing what other people think about it, and how much frequently or how common these are in other parts of the world, and the ecology that you see in them. Thanks.